Okay. So, welcome everybody to the master seminar of our department. This is the first session of the semester. We are very excited to host this event, self-organized event of sharing and showing our work as master students to the rest of the community. And today we have two very special speakers, personal friends of mine, and we have prepared two very interesting presentations. So first is Matías Neto with the presentation Emergence of Species, an extension to the cooperative case.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the presentation, Sebastian. And today I'm going to present emergence of species and extension to the cooperative case. Here is the table. Here is the table of contents of the presentation. First, a brief introduction to the subject, then some advances and the references used in the presentation. So, first, the subject is adaptive dynamics. In mathematical ecology, there are several approaches from which to study the interaction of the species in a specific ecosystem. One approach is to study a single population structured according to a trait space, which may be finite or continuous. What is a trait space? A trait space is like a characteristic space of the species. For example, the length of the legs, the number of eyes, the amount of carbon that some species consumes in the metabolic network. So it can allow a lot of cases in ecology. This approach of adaptive dynamics allows us to study the emergence of species, that is, a speciation process. And adaptive dynamics has three ground ideas that support that theory. One is that the species that survive are those that are best adapted to the ecosystem. This idea is from the theory of evolution. The second ground idea is that there are evolutionary mechanisms that operate in adaptation, such as adopting evolutionary stable strategies. What is an evolutionary stable strategy? Well, the adaptive dynamics is not only an approach from PDEs or EDO. It has some elements of game theory. So we can think that the species, an individual of some species, take a strategy to interact with other individuals of the species. So the questions that made adaptive dynamic is, what is evolutionary stable strategy? Or what could be a strategy that can survive in the environment, that can survive in the ecosystem, and not let that some other populations invade that ecosystem. So it's evolutionary and it's stable. An evolutionary stable strategy selects some traits. So select some characteristics of the populations that ensure the persistence of the species. So for seeing some examples of this process, we'll see a bit later, but first some definitions. Well, the population is represented by the density F of individuals characterized by the trait Y at time t. The density evolution is given by the following selection dynamics, where ESF is the selective pressure of the system, and we will use a logistic selection pressure given by this expression, where A corresponds to the bit rate and B corresponds to the interaction function according to traits. Well, for example, B, if B for some Y's is equal to 1, that is interpreted by that the interaction between that Y's are incompetence. But if the Y's, the interaction between that Y's is -1, it means that this is a cooperative case. This equation is similar to the Lotka-Volterra equation, but the difference that in this case are functions, and in Lotka-Volterra equations, there are vectors, and B is a matrix. So this is the integral differential form of the Lotka-Volterra equations in the logistic case, because the F that is multiplied there. So are preliminary results for the research on selection dynamics for structured populations. They study the dynamic of selection for the competitive case. That is, the infimum B is take positive, yeah, the interaction function. Obtain results of existence and stability of solutions and results of asymptotic behavior in the long run that allow to find ESS in several cases, showing a speciation process. In this example, we can observe a speciation process because if we start with the initial condition centered in 0, in the evolution of the system, we obtain the following plot where we can observe that the population is centered in 3 traits. One in minus 0.5, one in 0, and in 0.5. So these traits are selected by the ESS to persistence of the species in the long run. Yeah, this is a speciation because we select some characteristic of the population, and that characteristic is what is persistent in the long run. So what are the objectives of this research? Well, it has been studied that ecosystems tend to have a higher total biomass where greater complexity. It means more species and interactions provides more stability to the ecosystem. The persistence of a species provides greater biomass than the dominance of one over the other. In this sense, the cooperative case becomes more relevant. The examples of these ecosystems are the tropical forests, for example. And the challenge of this thesis is to study the extension of these results, the results of the paper, but the cooperative case. That means assume that the function B can change sign. So the infimum B is not no longer positive. It can change of sign in the space Y, in the space of traits. Some specific theoretical questions that arise are: how does the interaction function B have to be to extend these results? And are there some extra conditions to the B rate? So some advances, for sure, some advances of the investigation, we need to make a set of assumptions first. So first, we define Y as a compact interval of R, and the selection operator satisfies that A and B belongs in a sublet space, and that exists a partition of Y and exists a matrix diagonally stable such that every element of B is greater or equal than the entry of the matrix. These assumptions are sufficient to prove the following theory. The third assumption is like the weird one, yeah, because it's the difference between the other paper. In the other paper, they take the infimum B positive. So they use a scheme, an inductive scheme, where they prove that the sequences is a Cauchy in a sublet space, it has a Banach space, and then they prove that converge to a solution of the system. But in this scheme, where we don't use that the infimum B is positive, we need to take a more weirdo assumption. Yeah. But the theorem becomes pretty well, because for all non-negative initial conditions, there exists a Y asterisk globally stable fixed point to which the densities of the partitioned system converge in a globally stable scheme. So that is the first result. We have global convergence. The second result is for all non-negative initial condition, there exists a solution continuous in the system. And moreover, we have the next inequality. The third result is we have a stability property where for any F and G solutions of the system continuous, we have the next inequality that allows us to have unicity of the system. The fourth condition that we can see is that if the initial condition is positive almost everywhere in a measurable set, the solution for any time in that measurable set is a state possible. And how is the sketch of this demonstration? Well, it has almost five steps. The first step is define the partitioned system. When we use the partition of the interval Y, then we compare the partitioned system with the finished system given by the next equation, where we compare the function interaction B with the entries of the matrix Y. So what is the challenge of use this comparison? Well, we use that the matrix A is diagonally stable matrix. That means that the system has a Lyapunov functional that delivers global convergence to the system. And if the matrix A is diagonally stable, that means that exists one single positive fixed point of this equation. Yeah? So we use the result, but the result gives us a solution for this system, not for this system. But if we use the Lyapunov theorem, we can prove that the inequality holds for this system too. So using that, we deliver global convergence to the partitioned system. And then we have global convergence to the fixed point that is used there, because the Lyapunov functional defines in that way in the Lotka-Volterra equations. Finally, we conclude using similar proofs as in the paper. The first part is the only difference with the paper that I spoke before. And this part, the part of existence, is the only difference with that paper. But the third assumption is a bit weird. So we like to use a theory that becomes applicable. So we made some corollaries. One corollary is define D. D is a space that is like a strip in the space Y times Y. If we have this space, Y times Y, D is like this strip. Yeah? For every Y. So the hypothesis that we made is that if A and B belong as overlay space and the infimum B in the diagonal is greater than the infimum B out of the diagonal, we obtain the same conclusions as in theorem 1. This is like our conjecture of the strongly diagonal in this case. The proof is very easy because with the theorem that we see before, if we assume that Y is an interval and define the easy partition like that way, it is sufficient to find a diagonally stable matrix A that satisfies the third assumption. Yeah? So if we take Big as the infimum of the interaction function in every part of the partition, we can obtain the same conclusions as in theorem 1. Yeah? And this assumption gives us that the matrix A is diagonally stable, because in the case of the 2 times 2 matrix, it only satisfies that the determinant is positive. Finally, well, what is the problem? The problem is that that partition is like a partition that is not fine. We need, or we want, a finer partition convergence. We like to know where the traits were being selected. But if we say that, I don't know, the trait between 0 and 0.5 is selected, and the trait in 0.5 and 1 is not selected, we want to know where in that point in between 0 and 0.5, what was the trait selected. But if the partition is not enough thinner, we can know that. So we like to prove this conjecture. The conjecture is, if the interaction function has a sufficiently strong diagonal, that is, the infimum B is greater in the diagonal than the infimum B out of the diagonal, then we have global convergence that is existent of an ESS. In order to study this, first some numerical simulation we carry out for the finite case. We prove that assuming that hypothesis in several finite cases, the ESS is proven, because if we observe the evolution selects some traits. But we want to know in the finite case, in the continuous case. So, but as a first step, seeing those finite cases, then it makes sense to study this conjecture further. So it was the challenge of the next step of my thesis. So thanks everyone. Here are the references of the presentation. and we have some time for questions, comments, and that.
Thank you, Matías, for your presentation. Are there any questions?
Yeah, no question. The strong diagonal condition, does it have like an ecological meaning?
Yeah, has an ecological meaning. It means that, well, we can think in the diagonal, we have these entries, R11. It means that how is the relation between my population with mine? It's like mine relation with mine population. So if the strong diagonal, it means that it's greater. In this case, we have a minus out of the matrix. So it means that my interaction with my own population is competitive. So if we have greater competitive with my partners, but less competitive with other species, we have in the cooperative case more complexity or more species that can be adopted in the system. Because if this can change sign and become, I don't know, negative, it means that I cooperate with my own species and the system can grow and nothing stops the system. So if we want convergence, we need that that not exist any species that is cooperative with itself, or is not cooperative with mine, for example. It makes more sense, or it's weird?
No questions?
I have a question about the interaction kernel. My question is like, if I were an ecologist, how could I model this interaction kernel, and why would I use this model? This model, and how can I build it from scratch?
Well, that is a very nice question, because in the case of an ecologist, we can interact with the continuous trait of a species, but we can interact with finite cases of a species. Yes, but in the evolution, could pass that if I don't know, I have 5 species, a 6th species that is not in the set of species initial emerge. So why emerge a new species? Why can explain the mutation in the species? This model can explain the mutation because in the continuous case, we can appear another species that are not in the initial case. For example, here, we have just an initial species centered in 0, but then appear a species minus 0.5 and 0.5. So it has applicability in mutation cases.
Okay, and is there a way to convert ecological data into this interaction kernel?
Yes, because we can approximate like with with con vecindades and every entry of the matrix. So we can make a continuous kernel from a finite matrix.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
No questions? Questions in Zoom? Are there any? Okay, well, we thank once again Matías for his presentation. Thank you. Okay, we'll continue today's session with our last speaker. He's in second semester of his master's thesis, so his presentation will be longer. And so it's a very interesting presentation by Matías Vera, titled Entry of Renewable Energy, a Stochastic Control Approach.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Okay, so we're going to talk about a model of entry of renewable energy given by a stochastic control approach. My advisors are Nicolás Hernández and Alejandro Fouquet. So this presentation will be, we'll have 4 parts. The first part is a massive entry model in which we're going to explain the problem, how do we model it, and finally, what do we need to solve, basically. Then we start talking about a little of stochastic control, what I'm gonna present the tools we're gonna use to solve the problem. Finally, we're gonna talk about a little simple example, okay? And finally, we're gonna speak about future work and what do we need to do next in these months that I have left for the thesis. So let's start by a question. Why not use only non-renewable energy? Okay? Non-renewable energy has been used for years now, for decades. I don't know if it's centuries, but non-renewable has basically 2 disadvantages, or more, but 2 notable disadvantages. The first one is price, and the second one is pollution, okay? But if you think of it, pollution is just more price, because the pollution basically means that you need to pay to fix the thing, so it's basically more pricey, but you don't pay the producer for energy, so it's bad for the one who buys energy and for the one who sells you energy, okay? So if we have these disadvantages of non-renewable, why not use only renewable? Like here in Chile, the solar panels are a large part of the energy. In a normal day, in a sunny day, for example, at a time, 80% of the energy produced in Chile is basically solar energy. So why not use all of it, create greater energy plants? And the answer is that renewable has a large disadvantage, which is randomness. You don't really know how much energy you're gonna get in a day, okay? If you have a cloud here above the solar panel, you don't produce the same energy. If the atmosphere is not the one you expect, you don't have the certainty of how it's gonna behave, okay? So what do we do in this case, okay? So in order to know what do we do, first, we're gonna know what are we speaking about when we say electricity market. So basically, the other way. Okay, we're gonna say that an electricity network is gonna be a graph, V and E, a directed graph, in which V are gonna be nodes which represent locations, and the edges are gonna be transmission lines in which I can send flow from one to another. Okay, and at each location, we're gonna have just 3 elements: a capacity, a maximum capacity that I can produce, a demand, which is self-explanatory, and a cost function. Producing is not cheap, it's not free. So it's gonna depend on how much I produce and how much I can produce. And for each edge, I'm gonna have a resistance because sending energy from a point to another implies losses of energy. And we're gonna have flow capacity because I can't send infinite energy from point A to point B, okay? This is a simplified version of the of the Chilean market. The Chilean market is way more complex, but if you think about it, you'll have three large parts, like north, center, south. So you have the most demand here because most of the population is here, but here because of the mining industry, you also have a lot of demand, but the capacity is mostly here. And here you have low demand and low capacity, but this model has been studied in a couple of papers, but it's a very interesting model, even if it's simple, have interest behind it, okay? So I'm going to talk about something called the day ahead model. The day ahead model is something that in real life, it happens. Here is something called Coordinador Eléctrico Nacional that has to solve this problem. And it's that given a demand and a capacity, the coordinador has to minimize cost subject to a demand constraint. What does this mean? Well, the production of energy plus the energy I get from other nodes must be greater than the demand plus the losses of the energy from the flow, okay? This problem have been studied, in particular, have been studied by Escobar and Fofre, in which they studied like an auction problem, a bi-level problem, game theory, and by Ocel, Correa, and Marechal, which proved a lot of theoretical results I was going to use. So basically, what I need you to understand of this problem is it's very well behaved. It has a unique solution, a continuous solution, and we're going to ask the conditions so it has an elliptic solution, okay? So what happens if we do not want to a day ahead, but we want a continuous model? Well, we can only think of it as a process demand, a process capacity, and since it is stochastic, we ask for a running cost. We take the expectation, and then this constraint, we needed P almost surely. That P almost surely is not because of the theoretical part, which in part is, but it also because the electricity market has something called a critical market, which is a completely different market from the one you use day to day, okay? So if you have a critical case, you do not worry about the cost, and you go to another market, which always have energy available, okay? So that has a real life interpretation. So the problem is, or the interesting thing is what if we are the ones who control the process, okay? If we're the ones who control the process, we're gonna get a finite time and a set of controls over the process, and then we're gonna consider this problem, in which we only add this term, which has sense because controlling a process is never free. You have to invest, you have to do things, so you need to add a different price. And this becomes a non-standard control problem, or is it really? This is an interesting question because people have told me yes and no, but I'm not going to go into it, but it is an interesting question. So how do we solve this? A way is saying, okay, it's a standard control process, just write Hamilton, Jacobi, Bellman, and see what's happened, okay? So if we write Hamilton, Jacobi, Bellman, we get this equation. So this is a standard Hamilton, Jacobi, Bellman equation, but the controls are not free to move. They need to believe in a set depending on X and Y. So the X and Y is basically the set for capacity and demand in which the day ahead problem is physical. Okay? So with this Hamilton-Jacobi equation, we can differentiate that this does not depend on the control variable, and this does not depend on the other variables. So we can separate it. And if we separate it, we have an infimum of a sum of cost, which is basically the day ahead problem. So we can solve this, and we can get this equation, which here, Q is the arg mean, which again is unique, continuous, and all the things we need. And we get a prettier Hamilton-Jacobi-Riemann equation. So it's done. We have it. No more problem. Well, it's not that way because, well, this set can be empty, and then the infimum goes to infinity, and this doesn't ever have a solution. Okay? So this is wrong, but give us an intuition that if we want to solve it, the problem, this is important. Okay, we're gonna need to obtain the maximum or of the optimal capacity, the optimal production and flow at each mode. Okay, so for this, we're gonna define this function, which is really, it's a function made so we have this proposition, and is that the day ahead problem is feasible if and only if this function g is greater than 0, and g also is continuous. So this k, which is the point in which the day ahead problem is feasible, is closed. Okay, this set also had non-empty interior and a couple more things that are handy to have. But once we have this function, we can consider the problem of maintaining the process feasible for all s p almost surely, and just thinking of the optimal production. So this problem actually is equivalent to the first one. So, and for this problem, we expect to have a Hamilton-Jacobi-Riemann equation close to the one we get before. Okay? So actually, this is something we got before going to Hamilton-Jacobi-Riemann equation. This is something we proved just by optimization arguments, not by pure optimization arguments, not by control arguments. But the way we got into it through control argument was something which a professor in Switzerland did in the board in like 5 minutes. And it was funny because work for a month, he did it in 5 minutes. So this is the problem, and now we want to solve it. We know where we want to solve, so let's solve. So we're gonna go to stochastic control. As before I said, it was a stochastic process. I didn't really use that it was a diffusion process. So really, now we're gonna use a common setup, but if we go to a different setup, I believe, I haven't proved it yet, that everything should be right if we had good conditions. Yeah? So in this case, we're gonna get a Brownian motion, an m-dimensional Brownian motion, a drift B, a volatility sigma, and a running cost F, and K is gonna be a closed set. Think about it as this K before, defined before. And for each control and initial condition, we denote this as a strong solution to the stochastic differential equation given by this. If you haven't seen stochastic differential equation before, think of it as an extension of ordinary differential equations. It's actually the same. You have same formulas. It's just that with the Ito integral, you can use Ito formula. So more or less, you can generalize ODEs to the stochastic case. Okay. So I don't know what I did. Let me go back. Okay. So the problem of interest may be seen as this one, which is infimize the running cost expectation given by staying in the set for all time, P almost surely. Okay? So how do we get the information to solve this problem? Well, actually, this is not a new problem, of course. And there are results behind it. In the deterministic case, a Turkish professor called Halil Metesoner studied and solved it basically. And he got that the value function was the unique viscosity solution of this equation, which is basically the Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation in the interior, because if you're in the interior, this is greater than zero, this is less than zero, and then you got that it equals to zero. But the difference is that in the boundary, you get that it's greater than zero. That have a like a control interpretation, which I'm gonna speak about it later. But later, in the stochastic case, Marcos Katsoulakis and Ishia Loretta worked for infinite horizon and got something like the same equation. Okay. And finally, this is not under classical PDE theory. It's not weak also. It's something called the viscosity theory, which use like optimality conditions to solve the equations. Okay. So it might happen that B is not continuous and still solves both equations. Okay. Also, if you wanna know more about viscosity solution, there's a user guide by Pierre Leon, Kendall, and Ishii, which is very good about explaining everything. But now we want some results of this type for our case. Okay. So something is that none of these results are useful to us because our problem is different, and because we don't have the hypothesis. This needs like a regularity in the boundary that we do not have. Okay, so we need to prove basically that is the solution of something like this. Yeah. Okay. The first one is the super solution property, and if we assume that B is locally bounded, then B is a viscosity super solution of the standard Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation. Okay. The proof is interesting, but it's not that hard. Is that the flow property of the stochastic process, which says that if I start from zero, go to T, and then go to another one, is the same as starting to T and this position and going to the final part. Okay. Something as a strong Markov property is also used here. But basically, you prove a dynamic programming principle, and then you use the standard proof for a super solution property in Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation. Okay, this is very standard, but it's fun to prove. This is the easy part first. For instance, the difficult part is the subsolution property. So to prove the subsolution property, we have basically, we thought about two options. The first one is use a penalization algorithm using this delta function, which is a penalization for going outside the set. So with this, one wants to obtain a control that stays in the set, but it does not have such a difference value with the unconstrained problem penalized. But the problem with this is, one, it needs additional assumptions over the volatility and the drift, also the learning function. So, and the second part is that you need to take certain controls for make this to work. So in order to avoid that, we wanted to use the weak dynamic programming principle from a paper from Bruno Buchara and Marcel Nutz, which is interesting, but it's really probabilistic. It's not really a control. No, it's a control approach, but the other papers were they relied a lot on partial differential equations argument. Here, they take a process and they assume things on the process. And then through probabilistic arguments, they get a weak dynamic programming principle, okay? So it's interesting from that part that you can get from one way or the other way to the same, basically the same result. But using this, to use this, we need to introduce a new value function. This value function is, we're gonna call it the open. And it's basically the same as before, but the difference is that you wanna stay in the interior of the set, okay? Why do we need to be on the interior? It's because we want a dynamic programming principle, so we need to move a little. So if we're on the boundary, we have not the facility of move to any direction. Here we have, okay? Given this, if we assume that the open is locally bounded and satisfy the pointing inward assumption that I'm gonna explain it right now, you have this set, you're here, close to the boundary, you can turn off the volatility. It means that it's not random anymore, and I can use a drift that point inward, okay? And you have like a count here, but it's basically that I could go back inside, okay? So from this assumption, we get that it's a sub-solution of that equation. But it's a sub-solution, I mean, it's a completely different problem and a completely different property from before. So how do we link this? Well, we have this assumption that is basically this one, okay? But I generalize this one. We're gonna need that for each point in the frontier. Boundary. There exists a control in which a radius and a neighborhood such that I can turn off the volatility close to it. And if I move a little, this pointing is still inward first. That's the assumption. Okay? So this assumption, it's very restrictive. And do our problem also. And it's something interesting about this assumption. What does it mean in our problem? What we want is in the boundary, kill the volatility and go back inside. What if we were in the boundary of the set of our main problem? It means that we're in a critical case in which we need to produce everything at every node. Because if we do not, we cannot fulfill the demand. So we have to produce anything in any node. That's an emergency. What do we do in case of an emergency? I don't care about solar panels. I buy things from outside. I invest in carbon, so I buy more carbon. And then I go back inside to a place where I'm more comfortable. And then I can go back to the planning of, okay, I'm gonna rely on solar and things like that, okay? So this assumption, even though it's very restrictive, is very intuitive for the type of problem we're working on, okay? So with this assumption, and holding that B and B open are locally bounded, we have that both are equal, and that B is the unique continuous viscosity solution of this equation, okay? The proof is rather simple. This, it needs to stay in the open and the interior. This needs to stay in the boundary and the closed one. This is more restrictive than this. It's an infimum, so this is greater than the other, okay? And basically, using a comparison result, one has this, and after a little of math, we have that both are equal. And because one is super solution, one is sub solution, we get the result. Okay. So with this, we have the tools to solve the problem. We already have the equation, but how do we see this in a real case? So now we go to a simple. No. Before that, I'm gonna explain this equation. What does it mean to have different equations or have different values here and in the boundary. We go back at what really is the Hamilton-Jacobi-Riemann equation. The Hamilton-Jacobi-Riemann equation, it's an infinitesimal form of the dynamic programming principle. It means that it's something like a local optimizer. So if I am in the interior, the local thing to do is forget that I need to stay in the interior and just do the best thing locally for me. So this is optimal in the interior always. But if I go to the boundary, I cannot follow the same thing as before. So I need to be suboptimal. So that's because here is a greater than 0. Okay? So that's interesting because the Hamilton-Jacobi-Riemann equation may seem like an equation that goes from anything, but it really gives us a lot of information. Okay? So now we're gonna pass to a simple model. In this model, we're gonna separate the control in two things. Some called the investment and some called the stabilization factor. And the investment is gonna be simply by panels, and it's gonna go this way. And the stabilization factor is, you may think it as if I need energy, I buy it from another place, and I can buy a percentage of the volatility from another place. Okay. And the demand is simply a basic demand, and then an uncontrolled process that may be seen as a planification. And the process, the controls are gonna be staying behind a budget, lower than a budget, and 0,1 because it's how much do I turn off the volatility. And then H is gonna be the cost of the control, a cost by panel, and then a cost by a unity of volatility. Yeah. So with this, a proposition is that if Umax, the budget is large enough, is big enough, then assumption H holds. It's really easy to prove. We turn off the volatility always in the boundary, and then we take an investment larger than at each point and at each node, and then we got the assumption. Okay. So we wrote the Hamilton-Jacobi-Riemann equation. It's a very large equation. It's not really interesting to see it, but we can get some conclusions from it. So if we assume a verification result, it's something that we haven't proved yet, so don't think about it too much. But if we assume it, then the optimal policy of this problem must be invest in the cheapest option depending on a sign condition. This sign condition, what does it do? So, this here is the marginal cost, which you may think that is how much I gain from having an extra unit of capacity. So the condition is just that the price is less than the amount I'm gonna gain by buying this panel. Okay? And the other one, we see that the volatility must be lower by using that control. We do not have yet an interpretation for that control, but I think it has one. But it's basically, I go turning down the volatility depending on this, and if I am in the boundary, then I turn it off immediately. Okay? And this was assuming that PD equal to 0, because if not, the problem becomes really difficult to work with. So yeah. Finally, I'm gonna speak about some future work. What we need is to finalize details for the proof of the subsolution property, because the way it's made by Bruno, Chat, and Knut, it's for a type of problem, and we need to specify some arguments to extend to our results. Find a better assumption than H. This is something because having to take the budget greater than all the maximums is a little restrictive. I think we can get something better, but if not, H is a good enough assumption anyway. The other thing is that I said, trying to prove a verification theorem. This is that if the solution is smooth, then one can get back the optimal control by infimizing the Hamiltonian. And finally, and the most boring for me, is run numerical simulation to solve Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation in this case. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. And to finalize, I wanna show you these are places I went because of the thesis. I was able to live 3 months in Lille and go to a week for the studio. Thank you, working on optimization. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation. Are there any questions? I have one. So in the like in the beginning of your presentation, you spoke in terms of like stochastic process without any assumptions on it, and then you put the assumption, okay, this the underlying process was a Brownian motion, and you, like you mentioned, you can change this assumption to other well-behaved. You believe that you can do it. What kinds of processes or cases do you think you can extend this work to?
Okay, there's two processes which are interesting in this case. The first one is a jump diffusion process. If we have jump, the problem there is that we need comparison. So there we have like a little problem. But for example, the dynamic programming principle or the weak dynamic programming principle should hold in that case. And another process that it's also interesting, it's a stopping time process in which we have like a process which we control, but we're able to choose where it jumps. We do not have certainty of how much it jumps, but we know where we control this time. Okay, so this type of process could be interpreted as buying like a plant, a solar plant. So this is another process that may be interesting, and I think the results are applicable to that case.
And that do jump diffusion have like a similar interpretation to that, or it's just
jump diffusion? The answer is that I don't have that much knowledge about jump diffusion, so I can lie to you and say yes or no. But I think jump diffusion is it's more realistic because the variation of the capacity are not always continuous. So it has an interpretation close to the one of the Brownian motion, but more realistic in our case.
more questions?
Thinking more in the application of this model, it's easy for a policy decision maker to take the initially numerical results and make a decision in policy of thinking or another person.
If it's applicable numerically and obtain a policy from it. That's an interesting question, but we are now trying to understand the theory behind it. Because if you think about it, this problem is not really the problem that sits behind the policy, because here this is paid by the people, the regular people, and this is paid by the producer. This should not be a minimization problem, it should be a gain problem.
So there's a first step.
This is a first step, and then we have to pass to the other one. But the other step, it's really hard because you need a state constraint game theory, which I don't think is developed yet. But then I'd say it's really hard to really obtain policy from simulation in real time, but allow us to understand how the electricity market works. That it's also useful for the real life problem to understand what is the best in our case on having that sort of interpretation of what the minimizer should be.
Thank you, Matías, for the presentation. Can you go to the slide where you show the polytonic world condition?
I mentioned that, okay.
Is the next one?
Okay.
I was wondering if is this a constraint on the geometry of the set K? Because, for example, if you have K as C1 set, then we can define the vector. You always have this kind of thing. But do you know anything about the geometry of K in the general case?
Well, I mean, I agree with you that the assumption it's very geometric. It's a very geometrical assumption, but it's a give. It's a give and give with the drift and the volatility. Not the drift more than the volatility. But if it's C1, it's really easy because if it's C2, it's really easy because you have the normal and you have the tangent, and you can. This assumption becomes not trivial, but becomes a very more friendly assumption. But in this case, it's also very restrictive on the geometry because you need that. You can get to like a cone, but then if you go to the same direction, the cone must still be in the interior when you move a little.
It's like a Lipschitz.
Yeah, it's like a Lipschitz, a little more than Lipschitz. But yeah, I think that's like the more we can give in order for this to.
K is a set control or
Okay.
K?
Okay is the set in which the state must stay.
Do you know if it's a integral or something, or is it just
In this part is abstract. In the other part, what you think in our problem is this thing that it basically, for example, in two nodes, it's something like this: Q1, Q2. This is this producer produce all the energy for all the system. This one produce all the energy for all the system, and it's like something like this. And if the resistance will go to zero, this tends to look like a polyhedron. So it's not a polyhedron, but very close to it.
well, you can make some approximation? Thank you.
In the example, what is the interpretation but taking PD equal to 0?
Is that you don't really want to escalate the network. What you want to do is to change to a cheaper option. So PD equal to 0 is basically that the demand is always the same. So if the demand is the same, the problem becomes not fulfilling the demand only, because changing from one technology to the other in order to have a cheaper cost. So that's the idea when PD is equal to 0.
So that makes a difference between the problem with game theory, for example, the demand change. For example, if you want to make this research in a game theory approach,
Really?
you need that PD is not equal to 0 and some other assumptions.
No. In the game, the demand is always like given, and with each demand, you always can like got a minimization problem and a gain problem. It's not a restriction over the how the problem. It's just an interpretation or what do you need when the interpretation of by there is not a problem if it's 0 or different than 0 or negative, can be negative also.
It's about the represented in the case and the condition it's not sufficient for the condition or something like this, or it's more stronger.
You need that some condition because of the yeah, but I think maybe a clear condition could be sufficient if we got more condition from another part, like how the dynamics behave, that sort of thing. I think it's really applicable to vehicle. And it's something that we can generalize it, but we haven't because we're gonna solve this problem first and then go to the theoretical, only theoretical part.
More questions? If there aren't any, we thank again Matías for his good topic. This finishes the session. Join us next week for the second session of our seminar, which will be in español. Está bueno.